The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, In the Field, Part 2. First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross stood 50 meters away. He had finished writing the letter in his head, explaining things to Kiowa's father, and now he folded his arms and watched his platoon crisscrossing the wide field. In a funny way, it reminded him of the municipal golf course in his hometown in New Jersey. A lost ball, he thought. Tired players searching through the rough, sweeping back and forth in a long systematic patterns. He wished he were there right now, on the sixth hole, looking out across the water hazard that fronted the small flat green, a 7-iron in his hand, calculating wind and distance, wondering if he should reach instead for an 8. A tough decision, but all you could ever lose was a ball. You did not lose a player, and you never had to wade out into the hazard and spend the day searching through the slime. Jimmy Cross did not want the responsibility of leading these men. He had never wanted it. In his sophomore year at Mount Sebastian College, he signed up for Reserve Officer Training Corps without much thought. An automatic thing, because his friends had joined, and because it was worth a few credits, and because it seemed preferable to letting the draft take him. He was unprepared, 24 years old, and his heart wasn't it. Military matters meant nothing to him. He did not care one way or the other about war, and he had no desire to command. And even after all these months in a bush, all these days and nights, even when he did not know to keep his men out of the shit field. What he should have done, he told himself, was follow his first impulse. In the late afternoon yesterday, when they reached the night coordinates, he should have taken one look and headed for higher ground. He should have known. No excuses. At one edge of the field was a small vial, and right away a couple of old mamasans had trotted out to warn him. Number 10, they'd said, evil ground, not a good spot for good GIs. But it was a war, and he had his orders, so they set up a perimeter and crawled under their ponchos and tried to settle in for the night. The rain never stopped. By midnight, the Songtrabong had overflowed its banks. The field turned to slop, everything soft and mushy. He remembered how the water kept rising, how a terrible stink began to bubble up out of the earth. It was a dead fish smell, partly because something else, too. And then, later in the night, Mitchell Sanders had crawled through the rain and grabbed him hard by the arm and asked him what he was doing, setting up in a shit field. The village toilet? Sanders said. He remembered the look on Sanders' face. The guy stared for a moment and wiped his mouth and whispered, shit, and then crawled away into the dark. A stupid mistake. That's all it was, a mistake, but it had killed Kiowa. Lieutenant Jimmy Cross felt something tighten up inside him. In the letter to Kiowa's father, he apologized point blank. Just admit to the blunders. He would place the blame where it belonged tactically, he'd say. It was indefensible ground from the start, low and flat, no natural cover, and so late in the night when they took mortar fire from across the river. All they could do was snake down under the slop and lie there and wait. The field just exploded. Rain and slop had sharpled. It all mixed together, and the field seemed to boil. He would explain this to Kiowa's father, carefully, not covering up his own guilt. He would tell how the motor grounds made crater in the slush, spraying the great showers of filth and with mud and water, sucking things down, swallowing things, weapons, and entrenching tools and belts of ammunition, and how in this way his son Kiowa had been combined with the waste and the war. My own fault, he would say, straightening up. Lieutenant Jimmy Cross rubbed his eyes and tried to get his thoughts together. The rain fell in a cold, sad drizzle. Off toward the river, he again noticed the young soldier standing alone at the center of the field. The boy's shoulders were shaking. Maybe it was something in the posture of the soldier, or the way he seemed to be reaching for some invisible object beneath the surface. But for several moments Jimmy Cross stood very still, afraid to move, yet knowing he had to. And then he murmured to himself, "My fault," and he nodded and wadded out across the field toward the boy. The young soldier was trying hard not to cry. He too blamed himself. Bent forward at the waist, groping with both hands, he seemed to be chasing some creature just beyond reach, something elusive, a fish or a frog. His lips were moving. Like Jimmy Cross, the boy was explaining things to an absent judge. It wasn't to defend himself. The boy recognized his own guilt and wanted only to lay out the full causes. Wadding sideways a few steps, he leaned down and felt along the soft bottom of the field. He pictured Kiowa's face. They'd been close buddies, the tightest. He remembered how last night they had huddled together under their ponchos, the rain cold and steady, the water rising to their knees, but how Kiowa had just laughed it off and said they should concentrate on better things. And so for a long while they'd talk about their families and hometowns. At one point the boy remembered he'd been showing Kiowa a picture of his girlfriend. He remembered switching on his flashlight, a stupid thing to do, but he did it anyway. He remembered Kiowa leaning in for at the picture. "Hey, she's cute," he'd said. And then the field exploded all around them, like murder, the boy thought. The flashlight made it happen, dumb and dangerous, and as a result, his friend Kiowa was dead. That's simple, he thought. He wished there were some other way to look at it, but there wasn't. Very simple and very final. He remembered 2 motor rounds hitting close by, then a third even closer, and off to his left he'd heard somebody scream. The voice was ragged and clotted up, but he knew instantly that it was Kiowa. He remembered trying to crawl toward the screaming. No sense of direction through the field seemed to suck him under, and everything was black and wet and swirling, and he couldn't get his bearings. And then another round hit nearby, and for a few moments all he could do was hold his breath and duck down beneath the water. Later, when he came up again, there were no more screams. There was an arm and a wristwatch and a part of a boot. There were bubbles where Kiowa's head should have been. He remembered grabbing the boot. He remembered pulling hard, but how the field seemed to pull back like a tug of war he couldn't win, and how finally he had to whisper to his friend's name and let go of the watch, the boot slide away. Then for a long time there were things he could not remember, various sounds, various smells. Later he'd found himself lying on a rise, face up, tasting the field in his mouth, listening to the rain and explosions and bubbling sounds. He was alone. He'd lost everything. He'd lost Kiowa and his weapon and his flashlight and his girlfriend's picture. He remembered this. He remembered wondering if he could lose himself. Now, in the dull morning rain, the boy seemed frantic. He wadded quickly from spot to spot, leaning down and plunging his hands into the water. He did not look up when Lieutenant Jimmy Cross approached. "Right here," the boy was saying. "Gotta be right here." Jimmy Cross remembered the boy's face, but not the name. That happened sometimes. He tried to treat his men as individuals, but sometimes their names just escaped him. He watched the young soldier shove his hands into the water. "Right here," he kept saying. His movements seemed random and jerky. Jimmy Cross waited a moment, then stepped closer. "Listen," he said quietly. "The guy could be anywhere." The boy glanced up. "Who could?" "Kiowa, you can't expect." "Kiowa's dead." "Oh, yes." The soldier nodded. "So what about Billy?" "Who?" My girl, what about her? This picture, it was the only one I had. Right here, I lost it. Jimmy Cross shook his head. It bothered him that he could not come up with a name. Slow down, he said. I don't. Billy's picture, I had it all wrapped up. I had it in plastic, so I'll be okay if I can. Last night, we were looking at it. Me and Kyoa, right here. I know for sure it's right here somewhere. Jimmy Cross smiled at the boy. You can ask her for another one, a better one. She won't send me another one. She's not even my girl anymore. She won't. Man, I gotta find it. The boy yanked his arm free. He shuffled sideways and stooped down again and dipped into the muck with both hands. His shoulders were shaking. Briefly, Lieutenant Crossett wondered where the kid's weapon was and his helmet, but seemed better not to ask. He felt some pity for him. For a moment, the day seemed to soften. So much hurt, he thought. He watched the young soldier wading through the water, bending down and then standing, and then bending down again as if something might finally be salvaged from the waste. Jimmy Cross silently wished the boy good luck. Then he closed his eyes and went back to working on the letter to Kyoa's father. Across the field, Azar and Norman Boker and Mitchell Sanders were wading alongside a narrow dike at the edge of the field. It was near noon now. Norman Boker found Kyoa. He was under 2 feet of water. Nothing showed except the heel of a boot. That's him? Azar said. Who else? I don't know, Azar shook his head. I don't know. Norman Boker touched the boot, covered his eyes for a moment, and then stood up and looked at Azar. So where's the joke? He said. No joke. Eating shit, let's hear that one. Forget it. Mitchell Sanders told them to knock it off. The 3 soldiers moved to the dike to put their packs and weapons, then waded back to where the boot was showing. The body lay partly wedged under a layer of mud beneath the water. It was hard to get traction. With each movement, the muck would grip to their feet and hold tight. The rain had come down hard. Mitchell Sanders reached down and found Kyo's other boot, and they waited a moment, and then Sanders sighed and said, okay. And they took hold of the 2 boots and pulled up together. There was only a slight give. They tried again, but this time the body did not move at all. After the 3rd try, they stopped and looked down for a while. One more time, Norman Boker said. He counted to 3 and leaned back and pulled. Stuck, Mitchell Sanders, said Mitchell Sanders. I see that, Christ. They tried again. They pulled over Henry Dobbins and Rat Kiley, and all 5 of them pulled their arms and backs into it, but the body was jammed in tight. Azar moved to the dike and sat holding his stomach. His face was pale. End of part 2.